Welcome to Inside View. I'm Dana Nichols, Senior Editor and Reporter at the Calaveras Enterprise, and I'm filling in for Joel Metzger for this episode. And I'm delighted to again have Congressman Tom McClintock here today to speak with us about federal issues and other issues and let us know what's going on back in Washington. It's now the summer recess, so welcome, Tom.
Well, thank you, Dana. Thanks for having me.
So we talked about a variety of issues related to natural resources last time, so I'm going to change it up and ask about something different.
Okay.
You're well aware that California's had a medical marijuana law for some years now, and here in Calaveras County, we have a number of medical marijuana patients. We actually have 5 storefront dispensaries, 2 of which the county officials tell me are fully in compliance with county rules. So this is happening here, but we are at odds with federal law. Federal law considers marijuana a Schedule I drug for which there is no known positive medical use. And I'd like to get your thoughts on this.
Well, let's start with the Constitution. Where in the Constitution, among the enumerated powers given to the federal government, is regulating marijuana one of those powers? They assert that it's the Interstate Commerce Clause that gives them this authority, and that might be true if this was interstate commerce, but this is locally grown marijuana being dispensed locally. It never enters interstate commerce, and therefore, in my judgment, beyond the powers of the federal government. This is an issue that ought to be left to each of the states, and I'm quite content to do so.
So you'd like to see it left to the states, but I have not heard the Department of Commerce suggesting to do that, or anybody in the administration suggesting to do that. I have heard some discussion of rescheduling it so that it isn't subject to the more harsh penalties for the medications.
Well, the voters of the state of California made a judgment that people who are suffering medical conditions, if this is going to help alleviate their suffering, ought to have access to it. I supported that initiative. I think, you know, I don't recommend marijuana. I've never tried it myself. From the reading that I've seen, it's particularly harmful to young people. But who am I to tell somebody who's dying of cancer and going through chemotherapy that they can't use marijuana if that's going to relieve their nausea from the chemo?
What would you like the federal government to do, and is it more of an administrative issue at this point?
I would like to see the federal government actually honor and obey our Constitution and leave to the states those powers that were reserved to the states when our Constitution was enacted.
That's a big subject. I mean, wouldn't that have far-reaching consequences for all kinds of regulation that we now have in place?
Yes, and I think it would be a big improvement over this massive bureaucracy that we've created in Washington that imposes all of these one-size-fits-all regulations upon 50 very different states and Lord knows how many individual communities across the country. That was not the way the system was designed. The federal government was supposed to exercise certain enumerated powers, with the rest being reserved to the states and to the people, and we've gotten far afield from that.
Tom, you're known as I guess, a strict constitutionalist, very principled on this. Despite the fact that we got some Tea Party folks elected in the last few years, I haven't seen a lot of headway. Are we making any headway on this, or is this somewhat of a hopeless cause? I mean, let's be honest here.
Well, as you know, the House just voted to seek standing to restore the separation of powers that's disintegrated under this administration. I think that's a very, very important step. You know, the American founders built a constitution that was designed to contain the natural inclinations of government to grow beyond any bounds. And it did so by dividing up the powers of government. I like to call it Mother's Rule. You know Mother's Rule. You've got one slice of pie, 2 hungry brothers. How does Mother slice that pie so every time both brothers are satisfied? One brother slices, the other brother chooses. That's the separation of powers that we have. One brother, the Congress, under Article 1, makes the laws, but they are enforced by the other brother. And you've got Mother, the Supreme Court there, being sure that the rules are being followed. We're watching that containment mechanism break down with a president who is asserting absolutely unprecedented powers to pick and choose which laws he's going to enforce and which laws he's going to ignore, who has to obey those laws and who doesn't need to obey them, and is even asserting the power to legislate on his own with his pen and his phone.
Well, specifically this break, I'm thinking about some of the immigration stuff that's going
Yeah.
on. Are you concerned that that's going to happen?
Oh, very concerned. The breakdown of our immigration laws is a prime example of what happens when a president who is required under the Constitution to take care that the laws be faithfully executed decides he doesn't like those certain laws, so he's just not going to enforce them. That was, that takes us far afield from a nation that once prided itself on being a nation of laws and not of men.
Well, let me ask this, though. To be fair, the Obama administration has been increasing a trend that I would say has been going on at least since the 60s and 70s.
You're quite right.
Because, there were, I think the Nixon administration was ordering
You were absolutely
bombing
right.
to begin that wasn't authorized by Congress and got us deeper involved.
This has gone on over many years by both Republican and Democratic presidents, but this president has taken it to a whole new level and is leading us toward a constitutional crisis.
Given that it's been going on so long, it seems to be it doesn't matter the particular individuals there, that this trend is going to continue for other reasons. I mean, how do you diagnose this, and how do we, at this late date, reestablish mechanisms to rein it in?
Well, that's why the House voted to challenge the president's changing many times of the law adopted by Congress in Obamacare. Now, I think Obamacare was a disastrous law. I voted against it. I have voted to repeal it at every opportunity. But that is the prerogative of Congress to change that law or to repeal it. It is not the prerogative of the president to change it. And yet he has done that time and time again. The House has now voted to sue the president over these usurpations. The problem we've had in the past is that individual members of Congress don't have standing to sue. But there is a body of law that's recognized that the institution itself does have standing to defend its institutional prerogatives. And that's the action that was taken by the House last week.
You've been in on those discussions.
Yes.
Okay, well, I'll be interested to see what actually comes of that. And which court would that go to, Tom?
Well, ultimately, it'll be decided by the Supreme Court.
Okay, so does it go directly there?
And that will then set certain guideline or guide rails that will hopefully contain this and future administrations. And it may not actually wend its way through the courts until after Obama has left office. But it is at the heart of our constitutional separation of powers. We lose that, then the Constitution becomes rather meaningless. Edward Gibbon, looking at the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, commented on the collapse of the Roman Republic as it degenerated into the imperial period. And his conclusion was that when executive authority is allowed to usurp the traditional legislative authority, liberty is forfeit in the process. And that's what we're watching going on today. And that's why it's important that we stand up and invoke that separation of powers through the court.
And yet that Roman imperial structure went on for what, another half a millennium?
Yes, it did. The Roman Senate continued to meet for another 400 years, but it didn't mean anything. Right. That's the frightening thing. You can still, it's like a rotting porch. You can still see the structure. As I said, the Roman Senate continued to meet, but the checks and balances that gave that structure strength and endurance were hollowed from the inside simply by being ignored until one day that porch collapsed.
Right. Well, and related things like citizen soldiers versus mercenaries, keeping the empire working, slaves versus free farmers. I mean, it kind of goes on and on. It's not it hardly paints an optimistic picture of where we're headed.
Well, it gives us warnings. And, if you walk throughout the Capitol building, you'll see Roman iconography wherever you go. That's supposed to inspire us because of the achievement of the Roman Republic, which was really the first true republic in the world, where freedom was of paramount importance. And many of our institutions are based on those republican institutions of Rome. But that iconography also ought to be a warning that when the people ceased to insist upon their constitutional prerogatives, they lost them, and they lost them for all time.
Yeah.
And that's really at the heart of it, if you think about it. All of the laws that are passed under the Constitution, you break any of them, somebody's going to show up at your doorstep with a gun. We've got a huge armed bureaucracy there to enforce every one of those laws. But if you violate the Constitution, what happens? Nothing. Now, why is that? It's because the Constitution was written to be self-enforcing. But that only works when the powers of government are evenly divided. That only works when the people who exercise those powers are devoted to the Constitution. And that ultimately only works when we, the people, insist upon it through the votes that we cast. If you think about it, the Constitution can only be enforced by its rightful owners, the people, through the votes that are cast. That, by the way, is why we require every elected official to take an oath. We also, by the way, anyone who takes up arms in our military takes essentially the same oath. And think about this. That oath, or variations of it, is to preserve, protect, and defend not the United States of America, not the United States government, is to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. That's it. That's the only oath. When we say our military protects our country, I suppose they do, but that's not the oath they take. The oath they take is to preserve the Constitution. And there's a reason for that. I think the American founders understood. If we ever lose our Constitution, it means we've already lost our country. And that can be just as easily lost from foreign enemies as from domestic enemies.
I think most recognize the long reach of the administrative arm, but I also think most folks would view Congress as pretty powerful too. It's not you're not exactly the weak sister entirely, because Congress does pass laws. They do have effect. People spend huge amounts of money to lobby you because they believe that it takes effect,
Right.
and lots of money trades hands based on decisions that Congress makes.
Sure.
I mean, are you really that weak in compared to the administration branch at this point?
We
The
are.
executive, I mean?
We are if the legislative branch is able to legislate by its own accord. Again, we've been talking about the separation of powers. The president gets to enforce the laws. He doesn't get to make them. The Congress gets to make the laws. It doesn't get to enforce them. And the judiciary has its own role to play to assure that those laws, those constitutional principles are enforced. But you mentioned the rise of the administrative state. That's a big part of the problem. Think about this. The executive agencies write rules. We passed Obamacare, which was a major act. It was about 900 pages. There have been thousands and thousands of pages of regulations already written, not by the Congress, not by the representatives of people, but by the administrative agency. But that administrative agency is now legislating. The administrative agency also enforces those laws. And if you run afoul of them, you will appear not in a federal court with all the rights of due process. You will appear before an administrative court of the same department. So we've taken that separation of powers that kept those powers distinct and separate, and we've put them all back together in this administrative state. And that is antithetical to the design of the Constitution. You now have you are 10 times now more likely to be hauled before an administrative law judge than you are to appear in a federal court where you have the rights of due process.
Right.
That's a trend we have to stop.
Let's get into a messy administrative area here. Like the rest of the United States, Calaveras County a few years back got new flood insurance rate maps, which are established by the Federal Emergency Management Agency. That agency's stated goal was to put things back in whack, that they had not been charging people enough for insurance to really pay what it cost, which sounds reasonable. But in fact, here as elsewhere, there were people who were designated as being in a flood zone who in fact were at no risk. And so it had the effect of charging a whole bunch of people for flood insurance who really weren't at risk. And it had the appearance of being just a way to fund losses from hurricanes and other large-scale disasters. So what can we do? I just recently interviewed some more frustrated property owners.
Why do we allow the federal government to get involved in decisions that used to be made between individual parties. It used to be, before the federal government got involved, if you went to a lender and wanted to borrow on a parcel, the lender would say, okay, we know you've been a pretty good person in paying back your debts, but why don't we put up your house as collateral and we can fund that loan.
Well, Tom,
but then the question becomes, what's the risk of that particular property? Is there a flood risk? Well, that risk was assessed by a whole bunch of insurance companies that were competing with each other. They made a judgment individually of what that risk was, and the price of your insurance reflected that risk. If the price was too high, you'd say, no, thank you, I don't want to take out that policy. If the risk was too great for the banker would say, no, we just can't make you that loan. But it was through the voluntary associations of individuals exercising their best judgment as to what was in their best interests. And if those interests coincided, the deal took place, and if they didn't coincide, the deal didn't take place, but the federal government was not involved.
In fact, though, the federal government does intervene after and during major disasters and provides a whole variety of aid, both taxpayer-funded stuff, and then it would be better for the federal government in those cases if those who were injured did have insurance. And I think that's the motive, is that why
people should have insurance. But again,
right.
that was enforced through the loans that were made by lenders. The lenders would usually require you have some form of insurance, and they would make their best judgment as to how far that insurance coverage should go to protect their collateral. And then the homeowner would make the decision over whether that combined cost that gave accurate price signals of what's the risk of this property, what's the risk of defaulting on the loan. They could make good, accurate decisions as to what was in their best interest. The federal government has completely corrupted that price data to the point where nobody can make a rational decision anymore. And then you have calls for more and more government intervention. I think we need to start untangling the government from the decisions that used to be made very effectively between a willing buyer and a willing seller.
How do we do that?
We go back to those constitutional principles. This is all public policy. It's all within our power to control. Our country has not been struck down by a mysterious act of God. These are all acts of government, and they can change the moment we summon the political will to do so. But we first have to understand, what is the mechanics of freedom? Why is it that free societies are always prosperous societies, and the more government and authoritarianism, the less prosperous they become?
Right.
What are those mechanisms? And it comes down to the freedom of a buyer and a seller to reach a common decision that's in their mutual best interest. And that doesn't require government. If I give you $1 for a cup of coffee, what's going on there? You're telling me that my dollar's worth more to you than your cup of coffee. And at that very same moment, I'm telling you that your cup of coffee is worth more to me than my dollar. So when we make that exchange, we're both going away richer. We're both going away with something of greater value than we took in. But suppose now some third party butts its nose into that discussion and says, oh, no, the coffee has to be 110 degrees, and it has to be in a biodegradable container, and it has to include a swizzle stick and be covered. It's going to be consumed more than 25 feet from the point of sale. Condiments must be available, and so on. Every one of those conditions reduces the value of that transaction for one or the other of us until the value is destroyed. That's what too much government regulation does.
Right.
Government has an important role to play.
I think you've made your case
Okay.
well, and I think that many people are sympathetic, and most of us would prefer to live in a world with much less regulation, where it was more personal relationships, our own reputation, sort of freely adjudicated situations. But how we get back to that is where I'm like, because I think philosophically sounds great. Yeah, give me a world that's simpler, without huge bureaucracies regulating things that I can satisfactorily do on a more improvisational basis. Understand that. But how do we get back to that? Because it's such a crowded world. We've piled layer upon layer of complexity. Our systems are complex. I mean, the systems that provide me my food, my water, they're not simple. I mean,
and yet 2,000 years ago, Cicero spoke that the best laws were the simple laws.
Right.
I mean, laws that become so complex and so complicated that no one can possibly know them and therefore can constantly run afoul of them is not a just system.
Wow.
And a society in which individuals are no longer free to enter into those voluntary associations with each other is not going to be a prosperous society, and it's ultimately not going to be a happy society.
Interesting stuff. This is a strange election year here in the 4th District, and I've never been in a district where I had 2 Republicans running in the general election. So I did what I often do as a journalist when I need to get unscientific but possibly useful information, and I asked the person who was cutting my hair, "What are you hearing?" And this person who's cutting my hair said, "People are confused." And I know that you're going to compare yourself to your rival, Art Moore, and campaign, but any thoughts on this? Isn't it confusing to have 2 Republicans on the ticket in the general election?
It's this new jungle primary that we adopted several years ago, where the fields can be manipulated, and in many cases you end up not with a choice between parties with different viewpoints, but with parties with the same viewpoint. There was one race down in San Bernardino County last year. Because of these new rules, it's a highly Democratic district. Because of the way the election shaped up, their only choice in the general election was between 2 Republicans. Majority Democratic district, overwhelming majority Democratic district, but because the field had been manipulated in a manner that produced 2 Republican candidates, you had no other choices. Plus, it's destroying the third parties. Now, the third parties rarely get elected, but the third parties often bring up the new ideas that the 2 major parties have to address. They've been completely knocked off of the ballot as a result of this new system in California. You know, I think we need to go back to the days when we had, you know, the Republicans got together and decided on who their candidate was going to be. The Democrats got together and decided who their Democrat was going to be. So did the Libertarians and the Green Party and every other third parties. And then you had a real debate over real issues, not the kind of manipulation that we've seen in recent years with this new system of ours. But ultimately what it does is to destroy the variety of choices for voters. One of the reasons that it was sold to us was, oh, well, this will increase voter interest and participation. It's done exactly the opposite. Since this system was imposed in California, we've seen a dramatic fall off in voter interest, and the reason is because it has radically constricted the choices that people once had.
Well, the person who cut my hair, who talks to a lot of people, and fairly knowledgeable person, had that sense that it might just discourage people from voting because they couldn't. Although along those lines, I wanted to ask, if I was to try to figure out, well, who's the establishment candidate between you and Art Moore? Because I think of you as a strict constitutionalist. You do criticize your colleagues in the Republican Party at times for some of their votes. And then Art is selling himself as somebody who is going to collaborate with others in Congress, perhaps more easily. Who's the establishment Republican here? Is there one?
Well, really, you can't make that comparison because Mr. Moore, although he's 36 years old, has never voted in his life until he decided to run for Congress. He's never written a letter to the editor. He's never stood up in a public meeting. He says it's because he was in the military, but for the last 9 years, he's not been in the regular Army, he's been in the National Guard. He's still in the Maryland National Guard, and yet he asserts that it wasn't appropriate for him to vote. Well, if it's not appropriate for him to vote as a member of the National Guard, how is it appropriate for him to run for Congress as a member of the National Guard? It's a very bizarre situation, and once people realize that, you know, he's never even cast a vote in his life, we find that the support drops off for him very quickly.
Right. Well, so you have to get your message out, basically. Are you an establishment Republican?
I'm a lifelong Republican, but my loyalty is not to the Republican Party. My loyalty is to the principles of the American founding. My loyalty to the Republican Party extends only so far as it is loyal to those principles.
And you started, when we had our mic check, you started reciting by memory Lincoln's famous speech, who of course is maybe the most famous Republican of all time.
Can't go wrong quoting Lincoln.
No, you can't go wrong quoting Lincoln, but that was a time of optimism, of building industrial infrastructure.
Actually, It was a time of great division within our country.
But that resolved
Exactly.
after a terrible price.
Right, but how did it resolve? It resolved by our finding our way back to those constitutional principles that had built the country. You know, people say, oh, things are so partisan in Washington these days, and I remind them, if you think it's partisan now, back in 1856, Congressman Preston Brooks walked across the Capitol into the Senate chambers, approached Senator Charles Sumner, who was seated at his desk addressing envelopes, took his walking stick and shattered it over Sumner's head, damn near killing Sumner and shattering his walking stick into a million pieces. Brooks' constituents responded to that act by sending him more walking sticks.
Well, I'm not sure the South would say that we restored constitutional principles when the Civil War ended. The
Oh,
South,
we most certainly did.
Right, and that might be the majority view, but then Lincoln also succeeded in basically building, I don't know if we could call it a new American century, but he put in place systems of banking and business and getting the railroads built. There were things that got started then that created a prosperous economy that lasted for a long time.
What established that was by restoring the constitutional principles that had been set in motion by the American founding. That gets back to that point. You know, what was the source of our prosperity in the post-war years? The source of prosperity was freedom. Alex de Tocqueville in 1836 came to America, wrote a very perceptive treatise on American freedom and American constitutional principles. And one of the most interesting observations is he's going down the Ohio River. He notes that the Ohio River separates the Ohio River Valley between the free state of Ohio on the right bank and the slave state of Kentucky on the left bank. And he says, a brief examination of the conditions on each side of the river will readily tell the passerby what is more conducive to human happiness. He says, on the right bank, on the free state of Ohio side, he says, there's a din of activity. You know you're coming to a settlement before you can see it because of all the noise of activity and commerce. He says, the homes of the workers bespeak a prosperity that is a reward of labor. He says, on the left bank of the very same river in this very same valley, the slave state of Kentucky, he says, there's no human activity at all. Every now and then you will, basically nature provides the only activity. There's nothing but suffering, poverty, malaise. Same valley, same river. One is free, the other is slave. It is freedom that produces prosperity, and that was the great gift that Abraham Lincoln gave to our country. He restored those founding principles that built this nation.
Yeah, we're to less than freedom, but that freedom then was able to exploit great resources, the mineral wealth of the West, the forest, getting the railroads built. So the freedom did that in a way that the slave economies were not able to.
The point is, freedom works, and it's time we put it back to work.
All right. Well, Tom, thank you again for coming and speaking with us. I guess we're down to about 30 seconds. Any last comments on how you're going to spend the rest of your summer break before you head back to
Just
D.C.?
meeting with people and talking to people. I've found that if you get back to the district every single week, as I do, and hold a public meeting and talk to people, there's not a lot of trouble you can get into because the district won't let you. You start to screw up, people let you know right away. So I do that every week.
Thank you so much for coming.
Dana, it's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.